This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and this is episode 700 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by FanDuel. Thanks for tuning in. Before getting into the questions this week, I wanted to remind you about FanDuel Face-Off. FanDuel Face-Off is where you compete in quick, fun games against other real people for real cash. It has all sorts of games that you're familiar with, like Home Run Derby, Wheel of Fortune, puzzle and strategy games, and there's more on the way. Contests are action-packed and last between 2 to 5 minutes, so you can play on your couch, waiting in line, during a commercial break, wherever and on your schedule. Plus, you can practice for free anytime. Whether it's head-to-head, multiplayer, or larger tournaments, FanDuel Face-Off has something for you. Plus, in most contests, you'll be matched against players of similar skill level, so you're never totally overmatched, even as a beginner. Face-Off is also tied to your FanDuel account and wallet, so you can easily use your daily fantasy funds or sportsbook winnings in the app. Visit FanDuel.com/faceoff or download the FanDuel Face-Off app in the Apple App Store today to get in the game. Age and location restrictions apply, void where prohibited. See FanDuel.com/faceoff-terms for terms and conditions. The first question this week is from Patreon. It's from Malcolm. It says, how should we be structuring our bench with 6 bench spots at this point in the season? Handcuffs, flyers, stashes, second defenses, and kickers? So I say this all the time on the show, but your bench is an extension of your starting lineup. So if you're good at running back and you're not good at wide receiver, then you may want to roster more wide receivers on your bench. To take that one step further, though, since the question is about this time of year, it depends. It depends on how good your actual team is. Like, I got a question from someone on Discord this week asking if they should roster Alexander Mattison or Khalil Herbert when Dalvin Cook is on their roster. And my answer was that it depends on if your team is good or not. If you're at 7-0, maybe 6-1, and you have Dalvin Cook, you should probably lean Alexander Mattison. It's a floor play. If you're a 2 or a 3-win team, you might want to roster Herbert. Because in both cases, an injury needs to happen, more than likely, in order for those players to be true difference makers in fantasy. Now, I think Herbert has a much better shot to overtake his backfield naturally. I've talked about that for like a year now. But in terms of probable outcomes, there's going to be a split backfield in Chicago. And for Madison, he's not very usable without Dalvin Cook getting hurt. So if there's an injury to Montgomery and not Dalvin Cook, then you now have Herbert and Dalvin Cook. It's an upside play for that reason. Obviously, there's downside, though, because Cook could get hurt and Montgomery may not. But that's why you're making that move on a team that's not doing so hot. If you're in great shape, just have the insurance policy. Just roster Alexander Mattison. I do start adding a lot more handcuffs this time of year in general, because running backs can see a much faster increase in value than wide receivers can with an injury. And we have a pretty good idea at this point about whether or not certain wide receivers are going to break out. And if I'm rostering multiple defenses, I'm doing it because my league is deep. In a normal 10 or 12 team league with 5 or 6 bench spots, I'm rarely rostering multiple defenses. There's too much weekly variance to do that. Later in the season, when a playoff spot is locked up, or if I'm in the playoffs, that's a different story. So that's the general gist. It's hard to answer this one super directly because every league is just totally different. But this is not just league dependent. How you manage your bench is also individual team dependent. This next question is from @P2W Fantasy, and it says, Amon-Ra St. Brown had a massive impact on the fantasy playoffs last season. Who from this rookie class do you feel can have that sort of impact for this season? So other people chimed in and responded to this one on Twitter with answers like Kenneth Walker and Chris Olave. I think we already know that Olave and Walker are going to help you win a fantasy title, as long as they're healthy. The reason Amon-Ra St. Brown was so insane last year was not only because his production was crazy, but it also sort of came from nowhere. At least from the perspective that it's not like he was doing that all year. So we're talking about second half breakouts here, not first half ones. Not Kenneth Walker and Chris Olave. Clearly, I don't expect anyone to do what St. Brown did, but I do have 3 candidates who I do think are interesting. The first is Wan'Dale Robinson. He's seeing an insane target per route run rate right now. And he's playing in an offense that lacks alternatives at pass catcher. And like St. Brown, Wan'Dale Robinson's a slot guy. Robinson looked good in my prospect model too. He had an amazing production profile, and he ended up with a 92nd percentile score and a really good draft capital delta. St. Brown was drafted later than when Robinson was, so his prospect score was in the 73rd percentile. but he had a nice positive draft capital delta as well. And for the record, draft capital delta tells me that my model liked a player more than where he was drafted. Now, Wan'Dale was someone I more subjectively bumped down in my rankings because of size concerns, but he's still someone my model really liked, someone that I really like. So he definitely makes sense for this answer. One very low-key one could be Christian Watson. I actually think Watson's a decent stash right now. If he's out there, go ahead and add him. Aaron Rodgers came out and he said that they needed some playing time changes offensively. And Romeo Doubs has not been good the last couple of weeks. At the time of this recording, Watson's had some limited practices. He could be back soon. Now, with that being said, my prospect model viewed Watson as overvalued. He was still an 83rd percentile wide receiver given where he was drafted, but he had a bad production profile overall and he wasn't coming from a big program. He's athletically gifted though. Sometimes that translates. That's the upside we want. And then my final answer to this is Khalil Shakir. If he takes the slot role for Buffalo, he could really take off. I've talked about him enough on this show over the last month. You generally know how I feel about Shakir. But as you know, my model loved him, and one of his comps in that model was Cooper Kupp. Some of his other comps were not nearly as strong, but it's always good to see a name like that on the list. So those are my second half rookie breakout candidates. Players sort of coming from nowhere. Wan'Dale Robinson, Christian Watson, Khalil Shakir. This next question is from Patreon. It's from Chase. It says, "Heyo, what's your take on the running back dead zone halfway through the fantasy regular season? Jacobs is crushing, and he didn't have any attributes dead zone guys typically have. Thanks for all you do." Now, I try not to spend a ton of time reflecting on draft strategy in season because it doesn't really do us a ton of good. I want you guys to win fantasy championships. Saying that something went right or something went wrong before week 8, it really doesn't help with that. Unless there's something actionable to take from it, and in this case, I don't think there really is. I will absolutely break all of this down in detail after the season is over. Whether it's this or the quarterback position or how to approach the tight end position. So please know that's coming. I just have gotten a few questions about the dead zone over the last week or two in particular. So I figured I'd give this a quick answer. I know a lot of people will point to Josh Jacobs or Breece Hall or Travis Etienne, and they'll say, this is why the running back dead zone is stupid. But I think what's really important to remember is that the dead zone is about probability, not certainty. We see guys emerge from the dead zone all the time. This isn't a foolproof thing, and anyone selling it that way, they're wrong. And Breece Hall and Travis Etienne, for the record, they were 2 targets of mine this year from the dead zone, partially because of episode 643 on beating the running back dead zone. They fit the profile of players who tend to break free. And yeah, Josh Jacobs didn't really fit that profile. But this isn't something that just never happens. Not only that, but we can't just look at Josh Jacobs and say, see, this is why we shouldn't listen to you guys about the running back dead zone. Cam Akers has busted big time. David Montgomery hasn't been amazing. James Conner, Ezekiel Elliott, Elijah Mitchell. I know Elijah Mitchell's had that injury, but now he's got Christian McCaffrey to deal with. J.K. Dobbins. A.J. Dillon was sort of on the fringe. I mean, there are plenty of guys from that area of the draft who have been very bad. I think that just sort of goes back to what I talked about last week about negativity bias. It's easy to latch on to Josh Jacobs, but there have been a lot of bad players from the dead zone this year. Now, I'll do a more comprehensive breakdown in next year's draft guide, 100%. But my take is that the running back dead zone, it might be slightly better than previous years, but it's still been pretty bad. And keep in mind, this is only me looking at running back performance from the dead zone. I didn't dig into the other positions here. That's just as important, because this is about opportunity cost just as much as it's about the running backs busting. This next question is from Patreon. It's from Steven. It says, which wide receiver do you think will have the second most targets for the Chargers for the next 4 to 6 weeks? And this has to do with Mike Williams being hurt. So I think that Josh Palmer should be added. I'm not sure Palmer's going to be amazingly effective, and he wasn't that great of a prospect, at least given the way that I prospect wide receivers. But he at least has 4 games where he averaged about a 20% target share per game across those 4. So I think he would be the guy who has to step up and play the perimeter. My problem with DeAndre Carter, for example, is that he fit perfectly with Palmer and Mike Williams playing, but he doesn't fit as well with Keenan Allen being back. Because DeAndre Carter's been a slot guy, and Keenan Allen plays a lot in the slot. So that's why I think Palmer's just the safer option overall. This next question is from @TheAtomicGator. It says, are targets still an earned stat considering the lackluster performances of Drake London, Kyle Pitts, Elijah Moore, and Brandon Cooks? We know these guys are good, but they're just not part of their team's plans. Yes, targets are still earned. Kyle Pitts and Drake London are falling victim to an offensive scheme that just doesn't throw the ball a whole lot. We can say, well, if they were good, then they'd want to throw the ball a little bit more. But I'm not sure that's necessarily the case. They clearly just don't trust Marcus Mariota. This is why I look at target shares. And the target share numbers for those two players in particular, they've been great. Pitts is at a 27% target share per game rate. London's at 30%. And that London number includes a game last week where he was under 10%. Targets are definitely an earned statistic. We can point out guys who are underperforming, but number one, they could just be going through a tough stretch. It's only been 7 weeks. Number two, their scheme and situation could be failing them. And number three, by pinpointing the quote good players who are underperforming, you're ignoring all the good players who are actually performing. It's not like we have objectively bad wide receivers ranking really high in target share. Good players sometimes play poorly. And sometimes we think someone's good and maybe they're not. We have to remember that. It doesn't make the concept of targets being earned, though, wrong. The overall idea here is so simple. Good players see volume. At running back, too. It's just easier for good wide receivers to see those looks because it's a little less of a coaching decision than it is at running back. This next question is from @Saxton_Beard, and it says, when does a trade go past a bad trade into collusion territory? When you actually have proof that collusion exists. 99% of trades, maybe even more, should not be vetoed. If there's a lopsided trade in your league, if you know factually there was no collusion with that trade, do not veto the trade. And there are a ton of reasons that I feel strongly about this. Number one, judging a trade is subjective. What happens if someone really wants to trade Josh Jacobs for David Montgomery? Clearly, Josh Jacobs is the better fantasy asset. So you go and you say, Josh Jacobs is so much better, I'm going to veto this trade. But what if Jacobs gets hurt that weekend? All of a sudden, the person who is getting David Montgomery no longer has a running back just because a group of people viewed that trade was bad. That's not that fair. And yeah, injuries happen. I understand that. You're probably sitting there thinking just because an injury happened didn't make the trade any better. And you all know that I'm a process-oriented analyst. That's what I care about most. But the result does matter for a trade. You can't just say, oh, well, the process was right to veto this because it's actually impacting someone else's team, not yours. If you have an issue with lopsided trades going down in your league, maybe you should look at who's in your league and why those lopsided trades are going down in the first place. If there's a huge discrepancy in fantasy manager ability, then you can, number one, leave the league. Number two, change that for future seasons. Or number three, live with it because you want to play fantasy football with your buddies. And this is the baggage that comes along with that. Vetoing trades is generally ridiculous. We're adults playing a game. Let adults make their own decisions. If they're making decisions and doing it from the lens of making the best choice for their team and not someone else's, then you should not veto. If there's clear collusion, if it's obvious after talking to people that they're colluding, then sure, veto away. You have bigger problems to deal with. Also, is this type of thing even happening that frequently? Like, I see what I think are lopsided trades all the time in my leagues. I get that part. But is collusion this widespread in fantasy leagues? And if it's happening, ask yourself why. Like, what kind of adults are playing in a fantasy league and stacking one team to cheat? What are we, 9 years old? If that's happening at all in your leagues, you gotta find a new league. But my general stance is to let adults make decisions about their fantasy teams. You may not like a trade that went down, but that doesn't mean that that's how it's going to play out. Your opinions, my opinions, they're not facts. I get things wrong. You get things wrong. And the person making that lopsided trade, the person who seems to not be benefiting, they may end up being right when it's all said and done. So my more direct answer to this question, a trade will never just naturally fall into collusion territory if it's super lopsided. Collusion needs proof. And if you think your league mates are frequently lying about collusion, like you're going to them and they're saying, no, we're not colluding, when they actually are, if that's happening frequently in your league, you got to get out. The last question this week is from @Guysies, and it says, question for this week's mailbag. I just realized your 700th show would be a mailbag, so my question is there a particular show that is your favorite from all that you have done? And if so, why? Love the great content, and thank you for all you do. I appreciate it. So it is episode 700. I honestly can't believe it. You guys have put up with me for 700 episodes. You've heard the air horn 700 times, at least some of you. But one of the things that I think is important as an analyst is being open-minded to changing your mind with new information. Your environment evolves. Things change. How you felt 5-10 years ago, it doesn't mean you have to feel that way today. That goes for anything in life. When I started my career as a fantasy football analyst, and yes, it's hilarious that is my career, but I got my start by launching an ebook called The Late Round Quarterback. I wanted to start a revolution. I wanted people to realize that back in 2011, 2012, people weren't valuing the quarterback position properly. Slowly but surely, we saw more and more people latch onto the idea. Quarterback average draft position shifted. It changed. But in May of 2020, I took a step back while doing my yearly offseason analysis. I analyzed Lamar Jackson's MVP season where he broke out as a late round quarterback. And I came to the realization that the strategy was no longer the same. It was different. The very thing I built my career off of was not the same. So I did a study and I podcasted about it. That podcast episode number was 377. And I thought it would be cool to play a clip from that episode. It's a clip that sort of summarizes why I'm proud of that particular study, why I think it captures what I'm trying to do as an analyst. My goal is to give you guys the best information possible, period. I don't want to be right or wrong. I just want to be useful. And to be useful, you have to be open-minded. And I think that's what this clip really represents. So I'll close out the show right now before playing that clip. Thanks for listening. Subscribe to the show. Check out lateround.com. You know what to do. Hopefully you enjoy listening back on this clip as much as I did. I think there's an argument now that getting more of that second tier, a middle round quarterback, makes a lot of sense. Historically, drafting a middle round quarterback has been a waste of time. The average points scored among quarterbacks ranked 5 through 10 in average draft position has actually been lower than the average points scored by the QB 12 through the QB 15 over the last 9 years. Think about what that means. Your late round quarterbacks, on average, have actually outproduced middle round quarterbacks over the last decade. But the market is getting smarter. Years ago, given what Ryan Tannehill accomplished last year, we would have seen Tannehill be a top 5 quarterback in ADP this season. But instead, he's a mid-range QB2 because people are understanding regression more. They understand how Tannehill accumulated points and then it wasn't totally sustainable. The market is also understanding the importance of rushing at the quarterback position. Years and years ago on NumberFire, Sharp Football Analysis' Rich Rebar wrote an article and claimed that rushing quarterbacks were the Konami code of fantasy football. He wrote that article over a half decade ago, and people are just now really truly seeing that impact. Traditionally, we'd see a random great rushing season or maybe a set of seasons if you're Cam Newton, but we wouldn't ever see the passing numbers to match the rushing ones at the quarterback position. Rushing numbers really strengthen a quarterback's fantasy total. But for that player to go over the top and be a Lamar Jackson type like we saw last year, he needs the passing element to his game too. And like I said, traditionally it hasn't been there until now. The NFL has changed. We've not only got Lamar Jackson giving us insane rushing numbers, but Jackson gave us those insane passing numbers last year too. And we've got a handful of quarterbacks who have that type of ceiling. Maybe not a Lamar Jackson 2019 ceiling, but a QB1 or a QB2 ceiling. And that's really all you're looking for with a fantasy football quarterback to give you a significant advantage at the position. But think of the quarterback landscape and think of the players who have that dual rushing and passing upside. Lamar Jackson obviously comes to mind. Patrick Mahomes and his underrated rushing ability also comes to mind. Kyler Murray, Dak Prescott, Russell Wilson, Deshaun Watson, maybe Josh Allen. Those are the guys who have that true difference-making upside in fantasy football. The problem is that they're all being ranked that way. For the first time in my years of doing fantasy football analysis, the market seems super efficient at the quarterback position. Of course, I have my favorite late round quarterback choices. Ryan Tannehill is someone who has that rushing upside to go along with the passing upside. He's someone that you can target late. But he's not as safe and interesting as someone like Kyler Murray. He doesn't have the same type of profile as Russell Wilson or Deshaun Watson. This is where the late round quarterback strategy has gotten really, really interesting. Instead of us entering our draft rooms knowing that we'd be getting someone late, knowing that we could just draft loads and loads of running backs and wide receivers early to build depth and increase our chances of hitting on those players, we may have to start thinking differently. And why not think differently? Why not, in leagues where a lot of fantasy managers are waiting on their quarterback,
why not take one in the middle rounds? Because let me reveal something that a lot of you may not know. When I wrote the late round quarterback ebook back in 2011 and 2012, I didn't write the book saying to draft a quarterback in round 12 or round 13 or even round 11. Late at that time was round 8. It was where opportunity cost clearly was not significant. The difference between a round 8 pick and a round 11 pick is not that significant, you guys. Taking on an opportunity cost in the 8th round is not a whole lot different than doing the same in the 11th. And you know what's interesting? Back in 2011, the QB 12, or the last hypothetical starter in your 12-team league, he was being drafted at pick 80. That's the middle of the 7th round. Last season, in 2019, Jameis Winston was the QB 12 according to My Fantasy League's ADP. He was falling off draft boards at pick 108. Pick 80, where the QB 12 was drafted back in 2011, pick 80 was where we saw the QB 6 last year. If opportunity cost wasn't significant in round 7 or round 8 in 2012 when I published the late round quarterback, then why would it be significant in round 7 or round 8 today? Sure, the quarterback position is deeper. I'm not arguing that. I'm arguing the opposite end. Taking on a middle round quarterback hasn't been profitable in the past, but it also hasn't been all that costly. It just hasn't mattered. But if we're cognizant of the fact that the market is getting a little bit sharper and that the market is now paying more attention to mobile quarterbacks with passing upside, then we may want to think about our own philosophies shifting.